Hi, my name is April. Let's talk about books. A lot of people don't realize how big an impact Memphis has had throughout its history, and so I'm hoping that some of these books will help you to become more interested in the city of Memphis. I'm first going to begin with this book, which is called Elmwood, In the Shadow of the Elms, and it is by Per Magnus. Now, Elmwood is the name of a Victorian-era cemetery that was, when it was first created, located on the outskirts of Memphis, but now is located right downtown and really in kind of a bad part of town. This book is fairly academic in tone, with biographical sketches of some of the people that have been buried at Elmwood. However, if you, like me, are interested in iconography and symbols, particularly those around the Victorian headstones, there is another book that you can check out, and it is part of the Images of America series. It's called Elmwood Cemetery, and it's written by Kimberly McCollum and Willie Bearden. And in this book, you can actually look at the gravestones of the people whose biographies are written to the sides of them. Memphis itself was established as a city in 1803, and I do realize that there were people who lived here before that. However, I haven't been able to find books that are specifically about the native population of Memphis or the West Tennessee area, although there is a local museum that is maintained by the University of Memphis, and it's called Chucalissa. And because it's summer break now, I'm hoping that I'll be able to go there and that they will have some resources that I'll be able to look at, which deal specifically with Native Americans who lived here in this area before Hernando de Soto came through and ruined everything. The books that I'm going to talk about generally deal with people who lived or events that occurred after the Civil War, and the first of these that I'd like to talk about is called Disaster on the Mississippi, the Sultana Explosion, April 27th, 1865, and it is by Jean Salinger. The Sultana was a steamboat that operated on the Mississippi River directly after the Civil War. Right after the end of the war was declared, the captain of the steamboat found himself in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which had been under siege during most of the Civil War. There were tons of soldiers and previous prisoners of war, as well as civilians who wanted to make their way back north. Legally, the Sultana could carry just under 400 passengers. However, on this particular trip, it was carrying over 2,100 people on board. Just a few miles past Memphis, one of the boilers exploded. And because of that, about 1,100 people died. Now, this is the worst maritime disaster in U.S. history, but a lot of people have never heard of it, and it's because it happened at the end of April in 1865, which was during the time when people found out about President Lincoln's assassination, as well as the subsequent manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. Because of that particular news cycle, most people didn't even hear about the Sultana until years afterwards, and I know that I personally was never taught about it either. The only reason that I know about it is that there is a memorial to the people who died as a part of that tragedy in Elmwood Cemetery. A year after the Civil War ended, there was also a very significant event that occurred in Memphis, and it was a race riot. For 3 days, the African American community of Memphis was subjected to a series of racially motivated violent acts, including people just riding into their communities and burning down churches, burning down homes, burning down businesses, just wildly killing whoever happened to get in their way. At the end of those 3 days, 46 people had died, all of them African American. The events of this particular riot are documented in a book called A Massacre in Memphis, The Race Riot That Shook the Nation 1 Year After the Civil War by Stephen V. Ash. Memphis, as well as many other cities that were located along the Mississippi River, had to deal with mosquitoes. And with mosquitoes comes yellow fever, especially in the 1800s. And that's what this book is about. This is The American Plague, The Untold Story of Yellow Fever, the Epidemic That Shaped Our History, and it is by Molly Caldwell Crosby. The first 100 pages of this book are just about what happened in Memphis. There were actually several epidemics of the yellow fever in the city, but the most devastating occurred in 1878. At that time, there were just less than 50,000 people who lived in Memphis, but during that summer, 25,000 people just fled the city, hoping that that would save them from this epidemic. Then there were about 17,000 people who actually contracted yellow fever, and of that amount, about 5,000 people died because of the absolute decimation of the population of the city of Memphis. It did lose its charter and become a taxing district of Nashville. So it lost all of its autonomy to a city that's like 200 miles away. Even though Memphis lost its charter as a city, it eventually regained it, due in part to the work of a man whose name was Robert Church. And his story is documented in this book called Beale Street Dynasty, Sex, Song, and the Struggle for the Soul of Memphis by Preston Lauterbach. Now, Robert Church was a biracial man. His dad was white and his mom was an enslaved woman. I'm not necessarily saying that was a love story at all. Robert Church lived through the race riots of 1866. He became one of the founders of Beale Street, which at the time mostly catered to people's vices. It was kind of like a red light district. You would go there to gamble, to drink, to meet some prostitutes, to listen to music that maybe wasn't socially acceptable at the time. And because so many people were going there, Robert Church became the South's first black millionaire. He was one of the men who gave some of the money to pay for reinstating the charter of Memphis. There was a lot of stuff that went on underground, both literally and figuratively. So there were all kinds of deals being made, whether they were with businesses or politicians, but literally there were tunnels underneath Beale Street where a lot of illegal activity occurred as well. In the 1890s, Memphis was the site of what was, at the time, called the Trial of the Century. And those events are documented in this book called Alice plus Frida Forever, A Murder in Memphis by Alexis Coe. Alice is Alice Mitchell and Frida is Frida Ward. Alice was 19, Frida was 17, and they met at their finishing school in Memphis. They fell madly in love. And because at the time, obviously, same-sex relationships were not, well, they were illegal for the most part. They had to keep it secret. They actually made a plan where they were going to run away to St. Louis, and Alice was going to dress up as a man and they would get married and live as husband and wife for the rest of their lives. However, their plan was discovered and Frida was kind of shipped off to her family's country home, which is just a little bit north of Memphis. They still wrote letters to each other, but I mean, given the fickle nature of teenage relationships, Frida wasn't so much into Alice anymore. Alice did not take this lightly, however. One day when Frida was back in the city shopping with her family, Alice had found out that she was going to be there, and she ran up to Frida in the middle of the street, broad daylight, and slit her throat. At the time, this case was sensationalized and everybody was talking about it and writing about it. Not just because of the nature of the murder itself, but also because it was two women in love. And that was considered at the time to be a perversion. Alice was eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity and was sent to an asylum to live the rest of her days. Unfortunately, she didn't live very long. She died when she was 25. Both Alice and Frida are buried at Elmwood Cemetery, Alice in her family plot, and Frida in an unmarked grave. And Alexis Coe actually did come to Memphis and did a lot of her research in the archives of Elmwood Cemetery itself. Arguably one of the worst people ever to live in Memphis was a woman named Georgia Tann, whose story can be found in the book, The Baby Thief, The Untold Story of Georgia Tann, the Baby Seller Who Corrupted Adoption by Barbara Bizance Raymond. Georgia Tann operated an adoption agency called the Tennessee Children's Home Society from the mid-1920s until 1950 when she died. During the time period in which she worked, Georgia Tann and her associates were responsible for the kidnapping or the falsification of records of over 5,000 children. And of those, at least 500 died in her care. Most likely because of malnutrition, mistreatment, domestic abuse, Georgia Tan didn't care about anything except for money. And so these kids were just a way for her to get money. The large majority of the people who were affected by Georgia Tan's tactics were poor people. And if you were a person who didn't have a lot of money, or perhaps an unwed mother, and you were giving birth in a hospital, you might deliver your child and the doctor or nurse would say, "I'm sorry, your child was stillborn," or they might say, "While we were taking care of you within the past few hours, your baby died," when in fact the baby had not died but was being taken by Georgia Tan. The birth certificates would be falsified. There was no way for eventually these adopted children to find their birth parents because their documentation was just full of lies. Sometimes the children would just be snatched off the street by strangers. Other times, the children would be temporarily surrendered to an agency because their parents either didn't have enough money to take care of them, or because their parents were seeking employment someplace else, because we are talking about the middle of the Depression, when there weren't a lot of jobs, or when there wasn't a lot of money around. And so when the parents would come back and say, "Hey, I can have my children back now," Georgia Tan or her associates would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are." Or they might say, "While you were gone, the kid died." Some of the people who adopted out of this particular agency include Joan Crawford, June Allison, Dick Powell, as well as other prominent people who lived in cities around the world. There is a nonfiction book about Georgia Tan and some of the children who were affected by this called Before We Were Yours, and it's by Lisa Wingate. And there are two points of view in this novel. One is a young girl whose mom dies in childbirth, and whose family is split up by Georgia Tan's agency, and then a present day narrator who sees this woman as an older woman in a nursing home and kind of finds out her story and figures it out. Lisa Wingate is actually coming to Memphis in a few weeks to talk about this book, so I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. Now, because pretty much everything that I've talked about here has been super depressing, I want to leave you with a recommendation for a cozy mystery series. The series is the Memphis Barbecue Mystery Series, and it is by Riley Adams. The first book in this series is called Delicious and Suspicious. And the main character, the amateur detective in this series, is a woman whose name is Lulu Taylor, who owns a restaurant called Aunt Pat's. I've only read the first in this series, and the mystery itself is solid. I mean, it's the first in a series, so you've got a lot of exposition going on. The thing that took me out of this series that may not have such a huge effect on other people is the description of the restaurant itself, which is said to be like in the middle of Beale Street, and it looks like a house, and it has a little yard in front with grass and picnic tables. And as a person who has been to Beale Street a bunch, there's no place for that. Like, there's no grass on Beale Street. I hope you've enjoyed this video about books about Memphis. If you've read any of them, or if you want to, please let me know in the comments down below. And as always, goodbyes are awkward, so end of video.